Okay, great. So welcome back, everyone. It's nice to see you all after a long winter break. So we're back with our weekly series of conversations on human-computer interaction and the future of work and well-being. If possible, turn on your camera. We love seeing you. It can create a sense of community. I'd like to thank the organizers. So that will be Andrew Kuhn, who is here on the call, Linda Ball, Rafaela Sadoun, John Lee, and myself, and the National Science Foundation for partially funding this event. The first part, the first 30 minutes will be recorded and we'll have a conversation format, but we would love to hear from you. So feel free to type in your questions in the chat. And at some point, Andrew will be monitoring the chat and calling on you to ask your questions. But stay with us for the second part, in which we'll turn off the camera and we'll have a more kind of social interactions. That's an opportunity to just meet each other and get to know new people. So without further delay, I am delighted to have Jessica Cauchard here with us today. She's an assistant professor in industrial engineering at Ben Gurion University at the Negev in Israel. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you, Orit.
So Jessica, you've been researching kind of human-drone interaction for several years now, but we're currently in a different context. We're in the midst of COVID-19 public health crisis. And this is when we need to provide care, but this need to provide care often conflicts with requirements of maintaining social distancing. So can you tell us how drones could be used in this context to address the challenge of providing continuous care while adhering to safety?
So it's really interesting because drones have really exploded in the corona crisis. We're seeing them used everywhere in a lot of different settings. And when I'm saying everywhere, it's everywhere in the world. And it's been really amazing to see the shift from drones being used here and there to being used a lot during the pandemic. So one of the obvious use cases has been deliveries. And so this is something we've seen actually with increasing amount of autonomous vehicle doing deliveries. And so that could be relief supplies like medication, but it could be all type of deliveries. And what's interesting with automated deliveries is that they enable social distancing. If you don't have a person delivering, you can actually have this social distance. And if we think about it, it's a tremendous further potential for public health, because we can minimize, for example, the exposure of medically vulnerable population while still giving care to them. And so this is what is already happening. Now we can imagine a near future where we can have scenarios like remote healthcare, remote medical care by sending a drone representing a medical practitioner, for example. We're able to monitor people with sensors. We can check temperature, we can check BP. There's a lot of different things that we can actually measure from the drone at a small distance from the person and have actual telemedicine happening through those drones being carried away to people. So these are things we're already seeing happening. Another aspect of that is information. So we've seen, for example, governments using drones to inform and advertise, for example, telling their population to wear masks. In California, for example, they had this outreach program for the homeless where they would send drones to different places with a lot of homeless people and telling them about the different rules and what needed to happen. And so it's been really interesting to see the shift into drones being used for different contexts to being used specifically for the pandemic and to support, things getting better.
So these are kind of fascinating scenarios. And I think that together with the premise of these scenarios, we can also imagine misuse of, how providing information could become monitoring population. Can we talk a little bit about some of the concerns that involve using
I feel
drones?
the concerns are very wide as well. So it's interesting when you're talking about misuse, because we have different types of misuse. We have misuse by government, but also by people. And so maybe I'll start with people because I think it's a bit of an easier one, but we've seen people flying to places that they weren't allowed to get to. And some of those places were okay to get to with a drone, but not as a person. So almost like the drone extended their abilities. But also sometimes they were going to places where you're not supposed to go to with a drone because it's a military installation, for example, facility, and it's not allowed. but people have the ability to do it. And so this is one form of misuse. We've also seen very creative uses by people where they've been walking their dogs with drones. I don't know if you saw this video, it went viral at some point.
Oh, tell me more.
Well, you have this video of this person just like remote controlling their drone and walking the dog outside
Oh, the
with the
drone is
drone.
pulling the dog?
Yes. So it's very amusing,
Wow.
but I think it's interesting to see how people have been using those drones to run errands, you know, like doing groceries, and not always in safe conditions, but it's still been happening. Now, from the government point of view, we've seen a lot of surveillance. I think we saw it initially in China, probably because it started earlier there as well, but you know, checking temperature of people on the street, for example, using thermal cameras. And yes, we can do it. Now, should we do it? It's another question. In Israel, for example, there's been also surveillance through drones where when people were supposed to be in self-isolation, and for example, they're in high-story buildings, you'd have police units on the ground sending drones up to make a visual confirmation that the person is actually self-isolating. And so again, this is a new type of use that we were not really expecting to see. And then we've seen some policing. So for example, in Malaysia, you had drones going through the street and asking people to stay home. Again, we don't really know how much enforcing is possible, but we don't always want to know how much enforcing you can do with a drone. There's a lot of videos that became viral. It's interesting because all of this happened in the last year and we don't have much research papers out really explaining what's been happening. But on these videos, for example, you see at some point you have this mayor in Italy who's shouting at people and chasing them with a drone. And he finds it very amusing and I'm finding it very scary, especially given all the different types of safety and privacy concerns. But it's been happening. And I think the bottom line is that the technology is here, it's possible, and people have been using it. So that's the type of misuse that we've seen.
So this is really interesting, and kind of, you mentioned automation, right? That not only that we see more drones, we see more kind of autonomous drones or drones with kind of expanded automation capabilities. So one of my question is, how can we make autonomous drones, or should we make autonomous drones more transparent, right? If it's monitoring people, how do I know why it goes left and not right? How do I know
Yes.
why it goes to that part of the city, to this neighborhood, but not to others? So I feel that there are a few questions here. Some fall into interaction designs, but even before we get to interaction designs, how do we kind of address the transparency and explainable aspects of automation?
So, I mean, this notion of transparency is going to be one of the biggest challenge, both in AI and automation, I think, probably for the next 10 years. And it's going to be a lot of research to do to make sure we fully understand it. With drones, there's a lot of different levels of complexity. So some aspects are what can the drone even do? Because sometimes people have like, they make whole stories about what the drone is doing, but sometimes the drone doesn't even have a camera on it. So it's doing nothing. It's just around with somebody playing. But people imagine that the drone can do different things. So what can it do? Who owns the drone? Who controls the drone? Which may or may not be the same person. If the drone is capturing data, where does the data go? Why? For how long? And I mean, those questions are also here with other types of technologies. I mean, if I have a phone and somebody's taking a picture, the same thing may happen. But the fact that, you know, a mobile phone usually belongs to, you know, is a personal device that usually belongs to the person, kind of give us more grounded to what's going to happen next. And so, for example, if I see a police officer taking a picture, it's not the same thing as if I see a tourist taking a picture, and maybe the situation will be different. But what does it mean for a drone? And then what does a police drone look like compared to a regular drone? And so, I mean, this is a very big question, but there's going to be a lot of research to be done into really thinking what needs to be transparent and how do we make each of these aspects transparent. And some of it is going to be physical aspects of the drones, and some of it is going to be more on the digital side. And I'm not sure that it all comes together. I think we'll have to separate those two aspects to study them properly.
So thinking about, let's say, interaction design, which is where our community tend to have more control, kind of rather than regulations. Let's think, how can we, what processes and what methods should we apply when we're thinking about creating drones that are more acceptable in terms of transparency, but also in terms of kind of societal aspects?
Well, I think as with people, communication is key. You know, if we're going to have autonomous technologies in human spaces, we have to coexist somehow. And with people, we know how to cross the street, we know how to, you know, walk next to each other, at which distance. We have a lot of social norms. And so we're going to have to create social norms for those technologies to be present in human spaces. So part of it will be transparency, but also I think creating those norms, understanding what is acceptable. So for example, could a drone just come into my home? And this is a big question. I mean, would another person come into my house if the door is open? No, it's not acceptable unless there's probably an issue if somebody's walking into my home. But if a cat walks into my home, there's probably no problem because it's probably just walking there and I can just shoo it away. But what is a drone? Is it more like a person? Is it more like an animal? How do we even understand them within our spaces? Because we didn't have to coexist with this type of technologies until now. And so now we're going to have to think about all of these questions. And so transparency is going to be a big part about what can it do, what should it do, creating norms, creating legislations around it. Forbidding drones anywhere and everywhere is not going to be a solution. If we're going to have more flying technologies, they're probably just going to be around. You know, what about if I can have a tiny drone on me that can go and check for, I don't know, parking space for me when I'm looking for one and just come back? It's to me, it's pretty obvious that we're going to have flying technologies at some point coexisting with us. So it's really forming pro-social behaviors where people could, for example, ask, what are you doing here? You know, can you not take my picture or go away or you're too close to me? And things that we're very able to do in day-to-day communication with people, but that are very complex actually to put in place with machines. And so some of these challenges are going to be on building the right hardware and software to even make the perception happen for, you know, can the machine understand that I'm upset by its presence and it needs to back off? Again, something that just with very simple cues we can get in human-human communication. And so how do we translate that into machine and into human-computer interaction, both in terms of input, whether it's implicit or explicit, but also in terms of output and what information do I get back from the drone? Oh, we can't hear you.
Sorry. Following up on that, I just want to kind of mention that drones being flying technology also in some kind of aspect falls into safety critical systems. So just thinking about them from the perspective of safety critical systems, right? We don't want a drone to fall in the center of population. What are the unique aspects that kind of we can layer on top of interaction design with this perspective in mind?
So in terms of methodologies, we have some issues that the community is very young. So we don't have very well-established methodologies. And so a lot of what has been happening has been people working with simulation or in virtual reality, for example, but we don't know yet how well this will actually apply to real world scenarios. And so we need to work incrementally at building stronger and more reliable, especially safety-wise systems that we can slowly deploy. So I think we really need to work on this iterative process of first starting with, for example, Wizard of Oz or elicitation methodologies, and then slowly moving into prototyping and deployment. But there's also major concerns. So for example, how do we do research with non-users? Because very often in HCI, we work on user-centered design. We design for the person who's going to use the system. But now we end up with systems that are in populated environments with a lot of bystanders or affected bystanders who have to live with the technology, whether they want it or not. And our methodologies are not very well suited to work with these populations. And the way we do research is also not very well suited, because how do I ask consent to someone who's going to do a user study with me when I don't want to know, I don't want the person to know that is going to happen to them. And so in the autonomous car field, we've seen some research, for example, by Wendy Ju's team, where they started looking at different methodology where they ask for consent afterwards. So people experience the interaction and then sign the consent form for the research to be used. But it's not yet well mainstream, and we need, we need to also get the universities on board that this is a right way of doing of doing research, and that this is safe and that this is okay, and we need to educate. But I really believe transitioning to doing research with non-users and with bystanders is going to be key to introducing not only drones, but all type of autonomous technologies into human spaces.
Great. I think that this is so relevant, right, for drones, but also for the community kind of thinking about automated vehicles and other aspects of automations with kind of, if we think about inside the workplace, where it's not directly a user that is being impacted, but a kind of community that people that's surrounding that aspect of automation. I think we have questions from the audience. Andrew, would you like to take over and help people ask questions?
Yes. So, Chris, you're bringing up the issue of automation, semi-automated. So maybe you can tell us.
Yeah. Hi, Jessica. I'm wondering, in the field of automated driving, there's all kinds of different frameworks to think of gradations of automation, and I just don't know the space of drones well enough to understand, like, are there gradations of drones, or is it like the drone is doing its own thing, or it's controlled by the human? Is it very structured, or is that still a fully open space?
Well, that's a great question, and it's still very open. So we're seeing people working with drones often drawing paradigm from what we know of working with other types of robots, like ground robots, cars, and moving that into the drone space, but it's not very well qualified yet. And again, with drones, there's this really big issue of transparency. With a car, very quickly, you know if there's a driver or not. Like usually when you encounter a self-driving car, you're like, oh, it's driving itself. Or even when there is a driver, you often realize the driver is not driving. With drones, you really don't know. And the thing is, a lot of the drones have some level of automation in any case, because they're able to control, you don't have to control every low level aspect of the flight. So actually the continuum, I think, is a little bit different than it is with cars, because cars, either they move on their own or they don't, but the drone is more subtle, I think, in that way. So it's still a very open space. It's something we don't understand very well. As they become more autonomous, it's going to be a lot of shared control. So we will have situations. So for example, in agriculture or in some of the industries where you can just send the drone to be fully automated to do its job and come back. And, it could be even these very, very big drones. And it did the job and it doesn't need any human in the loop. And that's fine. But I believe that if we have drones helping us in our jobs, for example, we have a project with a firefighting team of Israel, and we're looking at having drones supporting firefighters, for example, getting into buildings in fire, detecting the fire and coming back with information. Then the drone needs to communicate with the person one way or another. It's there, it's in their space, they need to work together. And so like the control will probably be shared the same way that we are sharing control when we're talking to other people. And so I really like to think about drones much more like we think about people or animals, for example, in the way we communicate with each other, than thinking about them as a machine that's totally separated and we just need to control.
Yeah, I like how you put the emphasis on the human interaction there, because that was what I was struggling with, well, how do you get the focus on there? Because for the car, I find it evident. The drone, to me, it more feels like there's maybe a Mars rover, and we know that it needs to make a decision, like which direction to go. We can't really control it immediately, right? But you make a very nice point there, sort of that on the fly interaction with you on the ground. Maybe you don't even have to control them, right? When you're controlling with the drone, yeah.
And that's the thing, you may not need to control it at all. It could help you doing different things. We have this couple of projects. They're a bit far-fetched in the future, but for example, we're thinking, what about if a drone could help you get dressed in the morning? Like, just even sometimes putting a jacket on for an elderly person, that could be difficult. But if you could have this little home drone that just helps you put your sleeves on, it could make your life a lot easier. But that would be a very different form factor than the drones that we're seeing today. And that would be a very different type of help. And it's, it will be just for a few minutes. But if these few minutes could really help you tremendously, we'd probably do it. But even then, you should be able to communicate and know what's going on. And so we're slowly building up towards that, but we're at the very early stage, I think, as a community altogether.
That's really interesting. I know we have another question, but I just want to follow up on kind of this discussion before we move to a different topic. So I think that within the context of the future of work, one model that is more likely to be the model that we're experiencing is this collaboration between human and automation, right? A person that is working with a drone. What are kind of your thoughts about the new methods of how do we bring workers to imagine and design this kind of collaborations with automations, in that case with flying automation?
Okay, so I'll tell you about that firefighting example, because this is a project we've worked on for the last year that's been very exciting. So there was a paper about 5-6 years ago looking at using drones in firefighting, and the firefighters were very negative about it. They were like, it's not going to work. And then we saw in the last year or two already people being a lot more excited, I think, because the technology is more ready. And so all the constraints we had about battery life, about a lot of the different constraints are like starting to fade. And so people are getting much more excited one more time. And when we've been working with the firefighters here, we started working with the R&D division, and they actually had only 4 drones for the whole country last year. And so they were calling service providers to help them to monitor and to do lots of different jobs. And they're just starting to introduce them into the firefighting forces. And right now the drone is like an added tool that gives extra information. But when we started talking to them about future possibilities of having this human drone teaming, where the drone could be part of the team, they just loved it. They just loved the idea, and they worked very closely with us. So we've done some actually co-design studies, some interviews, some elicitation, it's been really exciting, both for us to see how they would include them, but also for them to think about, a future that's a lot more tech driven. They're very low tech right now, which is pretty impressive, because they have a very hard job, and they're doing it with very limited support from technology and very little situational awareness, and they have to make constant new decision on the go. And so even just having this like flying AI that can help them process, the chances and the risk and, making decision with them is something that they would really benefit from. And so, just the idea of this drone companion part of the team is something that they were very excited about, and that we're excited to be working with them on.
So I like the drone companion idea, and I certainly have to admit, when I think of drones, I mostly think of taking pictures. But Diana, you have another question that takes us in a different direction.
Yes. Well, like Andrew, you think of taking pictures. I think of war, and I think that could be true of people in a more global context, especially when we think about US drones. So with that, how do we as a community sort of push the stigma of what drones are as, for example, a machine of war in the larger society? How do we get over that, in your opinion?
So, okay, that's a great question. And there's lots of different aspects of this. So one of them is, the drones used for war are very different form factor. They're huge UAV usually, and they have their own purpose. And that's one thing. The way we're thinking about technology is more as we have technology that flies and can move in 3D space. And so I think we're taking a very different outlook. But I think there is a very large question about, would people who have lived in war zones with drones being used be willing to accept this type of technology as supportive technology in the future? And we don't know. And there are very, very big questions to be asked here. What does it mean, to have lived through this? Like, you have a lot of kids, you see a lot of drawings of kids who've been traumatized by drones, and now we're like proposing this technology to support them. It's like, is it even possible? And how will people accept them? We've also, we've done a series of workshops for different countries. Actually, one of my students, she's here today, Anna. This is part of a master's thesis. But we've interviewed people in lots of different countries. So we started in Namibia, and then we did Australia, Korea, Germany, UK, US. So we have this whole series of countries on different continents asking people how they would envision the use of drones. And what's interesting is that the country that was the most worried about negative usage, like terrorism, with drone was the UK. And actually, in a lot of other countries, like in Australia, people were very excited, for example, for cattle herding. And in Korea, people were very excited about the use of drone as like an extension of myself when I couldn't go somewhere, but I could send the drone to represent me somewhere else. And in Namibia, we had a lot of people coming from different tribes, and they were telling us, you know, like our infrastructures in the rainy season are very problematic, and the drone could like make sure that I go home safe, and the drone could support me. So it's really interesting because I think the context where people come from really makes a huge difference to how they're willing to accept the technology. But it's changing so fast, you know, and at the same time, you have this like Black Mirror episodes that are scaring us with drones again. But I want to believe there's a lot of very potential good usage that can really help make society better and support people better in their daily life. And this is mostly what we're focusing on.
Thank you.
Talk about Black Mirror. So Maxim, you have a question.
Right.
Oops, we cannot hear you, Maxim. I don't know if we heard you for just one moment.
Hello? Hello?
Yeah, now it's okay.
Hello? 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 Yeah?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay. Unfortunately, my camera doesn't work now, but anyway. So in popular culture, from my perspective, there are a lot of different visualizations of drones, right? There are a lot of movies, video games, books about drones and about the societies where drones is already the norm. So do you think that this popular culture helps people get accustomed to drones?
For sure. And this is actually something we use in some of our methodologies that are more design centered. And we've been playing around with Disney movies, like, you know, even the whole like drone helping somebody get dressed. We were thinking about Cinderella and having birds coming and helping somebody get dressed. And we've been thinking about, for example, giving personalities to drone and doing emotion recognition through portraying the drones as the seven dwarfs, because the dwarfs basically move in certain ways and behave in certain ways that we can identify them, even though they look very similar. And so I really think that the pop culture plays a major role into thinking about how we can use technology. And now if we're looking at a lot of the different science fiction that has been coming out in the last year, you see a lot of drone helping people, bringing them to places. And so I think it helps give us an idea. And I actually keep telling my students, do watch science fiction. They don't believe me. I'm like, you have to read research papers, but you have to also like read and watch science fictions, because I think science and fiction always inspire each other. It's always been the case. We can go back as far as Jules Verne, for example. I think it's always been there, inspiring each other from what can we do, what should we do, how should we do it. And then once people have a mental model, we can actually work with that, especially in HCI, to help build something based on that mental model. And so, for example, with very small drones, if you had a drone companion, would it be like Jiminy Cricket that could, you know, sit on your shoulder and maybe give you some advice? Or, you know, would it be like an insect that comes and disturbs you and you want it to go away? And the way of designing for those drones would be very different. But if we have those mental models, it makes it a lot easier to explain it to users, whether they're professional or lay users, and then to work with them into designing the technology like the right way.
That all makes sense. Sometimes I just feel like there are a lot of military use of drones in popular culture recently. So maybe that's affecting it in a somewhat negative way, maybe.
I mean, it's definitely a question we were asked a lot. I do see a shift, though. I think when we started doing research on drones, so that's around 2014, like that question came every day. And even when we coined the term human drone interaction, so the first paper we had in the field was called was using the term human drone interaction, and people would tell me, and I remember being on the job market and people telling me, you can't call it that. It's not a drone. You have to call it UAV because drone is too negative. But I believe it could work, and I think now we do identify ourselves as a shield, as human drone interaction, and I think for people to understand that a drone is just a device that can fly and that has different capability, then we can show that it has a lot of different form factor, different options. And once again, I think any technology can be developed for good or not, and it's very much what we do with it. And it is true that it is part of our responsibility as scientists to think about how our research is going to be applied. But again, I do think that we're doing very positive work with drones. And another of my students now just started his PhD on drones for emotional support. And again, this is really, it's a very different style of use.
That's an interesting perspective. Thank you.
Thank you.
So just shifting gears a little bit, Amir, you have a more technical question.
Hi, sorry. Yeah, about the interaction between drones, because I know I'm from a civil engineer, so I know all the automation of the car. It's very important now. The mapping, the whole like everywhere, so they can do the actually work. Like, but with car is very important. So I asked if it's the same with drones, the interaction between the drones. There's more than one drone.
Yeah, so, okay, again, two different aspects. There's the interaction between different drones and how do we create infrastructure so it's safe to use drones in cities, for example, when multiple people have multiple drones, or one person has multiple drones, or, and so we have to find ways to do that. We don't have, fully ready solutions yet, but there's a very large community of people working on finding ways to network between drones, finding protocols, having shared data protocols. And so this is something that's up and coming, and will definitely have to happen for drones to be deployed, especially because we have other things flying in cities. So we need to also define what are the right altitude and air corridors that can be used for drones. But there is a lot of work, and a lot of municipalities and a lot of cities and countries are actually working towards trying different things. So this is one aspect. The other aspect is, do we have to create protocol for interacting with drones as people? And I think once we have a better sense of what would be the social norms for including drones in different populations, then we may want to impose that those social norms are put into place in the drones. And we're far from being able to doing that, but this is something to consider. And the other aspect is going to be the multicultural aspect and how different populations may react differently. And right now, in one of our latest studies, just within the Israeli population, we're seeing major differences across major different population groups. And so once we move to different countries, we'll most likely see other differences in what people are willing to see or not from drones.
Thank you. So I just want to wrap up and thank Jessica for joining us today. This is fascinating, and I feel that we can continue this conversation much longer, and I hope we'll get to continue it face to face at some point. But I just want to mention that next week we'll have Audrey Giroir with us, and she'll be talking about deformable, shape-changing, and wearable interactions for the workplace. So keep joining us. We'll be meeting weekly. We have a great lineup of speakers for the spring, which will be up soon. And we hope to see you next week. So stay with us for the next kind of 20, 30 minutes, which is more kind of casual interactions, and we can stop the recording now.